second to last slide. We're going to do the Red Scare today during the Cold War, the second Red Scare. And then we're going to do JFK's assassination next week. And then next week you'll be prepping for your test, which will be Friday, I believe. So anyway, now you don't have to write anything down, obviously, but just think in your head. I'll give you guys 30 seconds. Let me time it here. To think in your head of four un-American actions or beliefs, or think about a time when you were accused of something uh, wrongfully. So I'll start 30 seconds. Just maybe list down on your notes. By the way, you should have your notes out. Just keep a notebook for these things. So list four un-American actions or beliefs. Just try to list any that you can. My timer stopped. So some un-American actions. Now it's hard to actually think of what is un-American because America is made up of so many different opinions and so much diversity. But some of the common answers, and these aren't, you can in this country you have the glory of believing whatever you want, but lots of people in the past have said atheism was un-American, or not being a Christian was un-American. Another thing would be believing in socialism or dissing capitalism is un-American. So those are two very common things. Not being proud of the military could be un-American. But most people would say socialism. As far as economics, I should be more specific, but lots of Americans, even today, are totally afraid of socialism, and that's kind of what the second Red Scare was all about, just like the first one. And then, have you ever been wrongfully accused of something? I mean, most people have light things. So, how did you feel when you were wrongfully accused of that? Well, you were probably pretty annoyed, um, probably rolling your eyes, having to defend yourself. So, the topic today is the second Red Scare. So, you have to think way back before Christmas break, right after we were done talking about World War One. We had the first Red Scare, which is where everyone had a ticket. Either you were a communist or you were not a communist. And so you had to form the largest group of people in the classroom, as many people in one group as possible without one single communist, and you won. And then once you all figured out that it was time to reveal who was a communist, you realized that there were no communists and it was all just a bunch of hysteria. So now we're talking about the second. Oh, yes. And the first Red Scare caused a huge increase in racism because of that. So if you were, a Russian immigrant or a Jewish person, maybe your chances might be higher to be a communist, you thought. So you might have kicked them out of your group. So that just kind of replicated what America was like under the first Red Scare. Lots of racism because many white Americans feared that minorities wanted communism because it would bring them equality. So the second Red Scare comes after World War II. So here's what Americans think their flag is going to look like soon, with the hammer and sickle where the stars should be. So this is something we would have normally done in class, but look at all these characters. You have six Americans here, um, and you're going to figure out, are they communists or not? You have to find out which one of these six is the communist. So we'll start with Joe DiMaggio up here. He's a famous baseball star. His parents were Italian. He grew up in San Francisco. He was divorced by Marilyn Monroe for being mentally cruel. This is Senator, and you don't really have to know any of these people, but Bobby Goldwater. He fought to legalize marijuana. Yeah, in the 50s and 60s. Is pretty ahead of his time there. He was an atheist. He hated religion. So when you're thinking of these people, think, okay, what is communism and who is showing the signs of being a communist? So we know that lots of communist leaders are cruel. So we have Joe DiMaggio up here being mentally cruel. We have this guy who's an atheist, and religion is banned in communist countries. Most classic communist countries ban religion. James Baldwin down here, he's a writer. He wanted civil rights and equality, and you know that communism supports equality, and he is a person of color. So maybe, and I'm just putting myself in the head of someone desperately trying to find out who a communist is, because he is a minority. He might support communism because it would bring him equality. Up here we have Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Well, he's from Canada, if that isn't a red flag. He was too soft about containing the spread of communism, so when he sees that communism is spreading throughout the world, he just kind of shrugs his shoulders and just ignores it. And he was also accused of allowing China to win the Korean War. So he, when people were asked during the 50s, why did we lose North Korea? People said, well, it was because of him kind of secretly rooting for China, communist China, to beat us. Senator Margaret Smith, she said hunting communists was unconstitutional because here in the second Red Scare, there's going to be a bunch of finger pointing just like in the first one. She said it's unconstitutional to, imprison Americans just because they're communists. She was nicknamed Moscow Maggie, and she also said that Americans should be allowed to be communists if they want to. Could you imagine that? Scandalous. And then over at the bottom right, we have Edward Murrow. He's a journalist. He lived in Eastern Europe in World War II. He hated authority. He was constantly getting fired. And he said publicly that cracking down on communism was unconstitutional. Kind of like Maggie up there. They both agree that if someone in this country wants to be a communist, they should be allowed. So they got a lot of heat for that. So, all 6 of these people during the Second Red Scare and hundreds more were accused of being communists. So, which one of these 6 was the communist? And the answer is just like the game we played in the first Red Scare, which took place in the 20s rather than this one in the 50s, and that is none of them were communists. So, Americans, just like in the first Red Scare, were panicking, frantically thinking that Stalin's communists had infiltrated the U.S. somehow, or Khrushchev, I should say. So let's look at the first Red Scare. So in your notes, please write the first Red Scare. We're talking about the second Red Scare right now, but you need to know the difference between the first one and the second one. And you need to know all 3 of these main bullet points. So these are the characteristics of the first Red Scare. It took place in the 20s, and right now we're talking about the 50s. In the first Red Scare, communism was spreading throughout Europe after Lenin's Russian Revolution. Now, in the 50s, it's spreading throughout all the entire world. And European immigrants and Jews in the first Red Scare were accused of being communists. And because of this, you had a rise in the KKK. Now, in this second Red Scare, you're not going to be able to accuse these minorities of being communists anymore because of the Holocaust. Now it is totally uncool and secret to hate the Jews in American society because of the Holocaust. So make sure you know that the first Red Scare had these characteristics, and we talked about that months ago. And now we're in the second Red Scare. It's the same story, except a little different on who is being accused. Because in the 50s, you cannot point fingers and say Jews are communists. So you have to get around the race thing. After the Holocaust, racism is just totally uncool in American society. Um, so the Cold War caused Americans to become terrified of communists. So instead of accusing, races, you accuse Hollywood actors, generals, government officials of being communists. Strangely, a lot of Jews, American Jews, are involved in Hollywood. So Americans in the 50s, instead of pointing just directly at Jews, were saying Hollywood actors. So it was a secret way of saying that the Jews were behind this. So the red iceberg, this picture here, you see Uncle Sam on the ship, and it's about to hit this red iceberg like the Titanic. And here you see the graves of countries that have already fallen to communism. So a lot of people think the USA is next. This is a map of the whole world during the 50s. And any country in dark red is already a communist country, and any country in a lighter shade is moving towards communism. So if it's orange, it's practically a socialist nation, and if it's yellow, it's turning into a socialist nation. So we are terrified that the world is eventually just going to turn all red, just as communism is supposed to do. So, what do the first and second Red Scare have in common? So, on your notes, please jot down something that the first and Red Scare have in common. So, you can pause this video and write that. I'm going to say it. It's pretty easy. The ones I could think of. Well, they both occur after world wars, and there's mass hysteria. Um, People left and right pointing fingers. It's like the Salem witch trials, where hardly anybody is really a communist, but everyone's getting blamed. So some real quick problems. You don't need to know this on your notes, but here's some of the things we've been talking about so far since World War II. During the Cold War, you have the Berlin blockade and how we tried to drop the chocolate down to those kids and food down to the people of West Berlin after Stalin cut our access off. You have the Iron Curtain. Europe is split between two. You have communists in the east and capitalists in the west. You have China collapsing to communism. The Korean War, which was communists versus capitalists. Nuclear bombs are everywhere. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which we just talked about, where Russia was putting missiles on Cuba and aiming them at us. And you've got the space race. So we are in a full blown battle right now with communists, and we are fighting them in whatever way we can without actually going to war directly with the Soviet Union. And this is an actual sign here from the 50s where it says the Red Menace is real. Report all suspected communist activity. Here is a little side note here. So other countries are having the same problem. So Japan is now a democratic country thanks to the United States. Even in the 50s, they were getting back on their feet from imperial fascism, and now they're a democracy. So this guy here is a communist Japanese person, and he's getting lots of attention in Japan, and the Japanese people are kind of moving towards communism. So here he is giving a speech, and he ends up getting assassinated by another Japanese guy, saying that if this guy wins these votes and turns Japan into a communist country, we're all going to be starving and ruled by these dictators. And so this Japanese teenager takes his family's samurai sword and stabs the guy to death right on stage in TV in front of everybody. Uh, of course, he's a assassin. He was put to death and he was hanged for doing this. But even in Japan today, the guy is seen as a hero for killing this communist politician and avoiding the fall of Japan to communism. I'm not going to play the video, but I mean, it's really easy to find it if you want to just type that in. It's not as entertaining as you might believe. If you go to Japan today, there's lots of souvenirs with this guy on it, magnets and hat pins and T-shirts. Now, in America, we have our own problems with communists. Though most people were not communists, some were, like Alger Hiss here. He is a U.S. government official. He helped establish the United Nations. Even today, lots of people say the United Nations is a communist establishment, but evidence emerged that this guy was a Soviet spy, and there is lots of evidence to suggest that he was, and he actually served 3 years in prison. Now, this trial here, you need to know. Write down. You don't need to know this guy, but know that this was the Alger Hiss case. You need to know what happened there, and you need to know for sure for air test. I don't even know for having the air test, but I'm sure they'll find some way to test you guys. The Rosenberg trial was something that you really need to know. It perfectly replicates the terror that Americans had during the Second Red Scare. So this couple, they were American scientists and communists who sold atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. So they are building more powerful nuclear bombs here in America and then selling that information to the Soviets. And when they found out that these two Americans were spies for the communist Russians, they were given a real quick trial. Lots of people say it was totally unjust, that their trial was uh, too fast to be a capital punishment, which is the death sentence, and they were strapped down to electric chairs and electrocuted to death, according or as a judge demanded. So this couple here made it obvious that America was in fact infiltrated by communists, and that there were spies everywhere, in the government, in the science departments. Um, they were communists in America, and they were selling secrets to the Soviets with the goal of turning us into a communist country. Make sure you know what the Rosenberg trial was. Lots of people were saying that because everyone was so afraid of the communists, that we were willing to sacrifice our own freedoms in order to quell the communist situation. So here you see a guy freaking out with a bucket of water, putting out the Statue of Liberty's flame. So in order to stop communism, people were willing to sacrifice their own personal freedoms, their constitutional freedoms. And the main person of all of this, the main character of the Second Red Scare, who you absolutely need to know, is Joseph McCarthy. He's a Republican senator of the 1950s. Don't confuse his last name with MacArthur. So here he is, McCarthy, right here. And he is a senator who is going to feed the flames of the Red Scare. And I'll show you in a moment. So make sure you write his name down and put a star next to it, because you need to know it's going to be on the test. Several questions about him. This is what he did. He accused hundreds of Americans of being involved in communism without proper evidence. So the guy was just pointing fingers left and right. He was the embodiment of what the Salem witch trials was, where just pointing at all these people saying which. Um, but instead of saying which, he was saying communist. So anybody in politics that he didn't like, anybody that criticized him, all he would have to do is say that they were a communist, and that he had evidence that they were a communist, even though he didn't. And the whole country would follow this guy faithfully, saying that he knew something that we didn't. So McCarthy was a really bad guy. He's a great villain in American history, and he is an American himself. He's a senator accusing people that he doesn't like of being communist. So here's kind of the mindset of Americans holding up these signs saying "better dead than red," meaning communist. Anytime you see the word red, here you see grandma with her picket sign saying communism is firmly entrenched in the U.S. Stalin must get out of Hungary. Stalin must get out of Hungary. Down with Stalin and the communists. So this picture was obviously taken before Stalin's death. You need to know what this was: the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And this organization investigated suspected communists. So this was one of the most, it's kind of ironic. So it's called the House Committee on Un-American Activities, and they're trying to stop communists in America, American communists. But in doing so, in trying to do so, the Committee of Un-American Activities is actually one of the most un-American organizations of all time because they were trying to silence people. They were trying to stop people's freedoms of beliefs. So, for example, if I said that it's everyone's right to be a communist, that's my American belief. I can believe that. But the HCUA might recommend that I'm arrested for saying that. So in America, it's like, yes, your First Amendment says you can believe whatever you want, except communism. You can't be a communist, which later is proven untrue. You know, if you want to have a communist parade outside of the school, you can now. But back in the 50s and the 20s, because of the Red Scare situation, the government temporarily said in parentheses and an asterisk, except communism. You can't be a communist. So this organization, which was led by Senator McCarthy, said that people in the government, people in the military, any kind of labor union demanding more pay or time off work, teachers were communists, scientists were communists, the newspapers were communists, and the biggest um, organization that took the hardest hit during the second Red Scare was Hollywood. All these actors, these many of which were Jewish, were accused of being communists. So make sure you write this question in your notes. Make sure you know this in your notes as well. That's going to be on the test coming up next week. How might the HCUA, which is this, violate the First Amendment? Your First Amendment rights, your freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. So think, if you were a communist, what can this organization now do? Your answer could be something along the lines of, well, I'm not allowed to believe whatever I want now. I'm not allowed to say whatever I want now. I'm not allowed to assemble with whoever I want now. And it doesn't even have to be just communist. If the organization you're a part of was accused by the HCUA of being communist, you probably could no longer be associated with them because you did not want that label on you. So if you were, uh, we'll move on. Um, the public would turn against anyone McCarthy would accuse of being a communist. So Americans were terrified of this guy because they didn't want him to point his finger at you. This is not Senator McCarthy. That's Charlie Chaplin. He's been famous since the 20s. Many Hollywood stars had their careers ruined from these false accusations. So here's Charlie Chaplin was one of those guys accused of being a communist. So if you're running against Senator McCarthy, all he would have to do is say you're a communist, and people would say, okay, I'm not voting for you anymore. I'm voting for McCarthy again. So the guy was unstoppable. So here's McCarthy, um, saying these Hollywood actors are now communists, and then you see these Hollywood actors' careers are now over, and then the people are just blindly following McCarthy here, pointing, saying, okay, let's get him. So McCarthy is our own little homegrown villain. So how do these accusations benefit him? Just know that write that question down, and the answer will be. And if you want to pause the video and think of it yourself, but the answer is that as long as he is accusing people of being communists, people are kind of faithfully following him, and people are afraid of him. So politicians are afraid of the guy because if you call him out on his lies, all he's going to have to do is say you are the communist, and the people are going to, your career as a politician is going to be over. So these Hollywood actors were starting to say, this McCarthy guy is a bad guy, and he would say, okay, Hollywood, you're a bunch of communists, and then the people turned against them. Um, so how does McCarthy fall? And the video is here. We'll watch the downfall of McCarthy. It's kind of hard to hear, um, but the answer is very simply make sure you watch this video. The answer is that McCarthy's career ended after he accused the military of being a bunch of communists. He was accusing America's heroic generals that fought in Korea and were about to fight in Vietnam and uh, had fought in World War II. He was accusing the U.S. military of being communists, and then people started rolling their eyes and saying, "Wait a second, these brave men and women who were fighting communists, how can they be communists?" And then people started questioning, okay, so if we know that the military is definitely not a communist organization, does that mean everyone else that he accused is not a communist as well?
In early 1954, with his power at its peak, Senator McCarthy takes a gamble. Armed with the flimsiest of evidence, he takes on a respected institution, the U.S. Army. He claims it is infiltrated by communists and that senior officers are turning a blind eye. The explosive charges trigger public hearings in the Senate. Live TV coverage provides millions of Americans with their first sustained look at the crusading senator and his bare-knuckle methods.
In this committee, activities may well determine whether this nation will live or die.
I want to make it clear that the United States Army does not coddle communists. This committee knows that. The American people know that.
For over a month, McCarthy and his team exchange fire with the Army's counsel. June 9, 1954. A lawyer for the Army, Joseph Welch, demands that McCarthy's staff release its secret list of alleged Army subversives. McCarthy responds by dredging up a past link between a young lawyer in Welch's firm and the Communist Party.
I don't think you have any conception of the danger of the Communist Party.
After years of bullying his victims, McCarthy is smug and confident. But Welch counterattacks.
Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. If it were in my power to forgive you for your reckless cruelty, I would do so. I like to think I'm a gentleman. But your forgiveness will have to come from someone other than me. Mr. Chairman.
Millions of Americans watch.
He was just baiting, he hasn't baiting.
Senator, may we not drop this? Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
McCarthy's gamble, taking on the Army, backfires.
Mr. Welch here has been...
His charges don't stick. Many in his own party turn against him. 6 months later, the Senate officially censures him. His reign of terror is over, and his reputation in tatters. He falls into the grip of alcoholism, which in 1957 kills him at the age of 48. McCarthy, in many ways, was destroyed by the power of television, a power that in the 1950s will only continue to grow.
So he becomes this ostracized American senator now, and it wasn't much longer after this video that he died of a heart attack from all the stress of being humiliated by the American people, and that was pretty much the end of the second Red Scare. So you don't have the rampant racism in the second Red Scare that you did in the first Red Scare, in part because of World War II. and the Holocaust. We don't want to repeat that again. But you still had the hysteria, the panicking that you had in the first Red Scare. And the guy that led it all was McCarthy, and the people that were hit the most or the hardest were Hollywood actors. So, what do you need to know? You need to know the difference between the first and second Red Scare. You need to know. One second. You need to know who was the leader of the second Red Scare. You need to know who was hit the hardest during the second Red Scare. In the first Red Scare, it was minorities. In the second Red Scare, it was Hollywood. And finally, you need to know, or no, not finally. You need to know what the House Committee of Un-American Affairs, HCUA. Now, on the air test, it's probably not going to say the House Committee of Un-American Affairs. It's going to say HCUA. They're going to expect you to know that acronym. You need to know what that was and why it went against the First Amendment. And you need to know, and this is all in your worksheet, what caused the downfall of McCarthy. Okay, now have a great weekend. We'll be back Monday with the assassination of JFK. And for the rest of the week, you'll be prepping for your test, which will be on Friday. And all that during that time of prep, I'll have a quizzes, maybe post the Kahoot. I don't know. I don't think I have a Kahoot for the Cold War. And then we will move on to the next unit, which is the civil rights movement. Have a great weekend. Make sure you do your worksheet.